Citizens of the world, welcome back to another Keep Yours podcast where we try and keep a few dollars in your wallet. And I want to start by apologizing for going so long in between podcasts. Life got busy. It was a crazy into a year. I had to do some sales trips, take care of some business stuff. And I've been really debating where to take this next. And I've got a lot of ideas and some new things that I look forward to next year. And part of those are not necessarily the same format that I've been doing. And especially since COVID started, it felt like there was a different opportunity to try and engage and help people. But also, part of the reason I started this podcast was I didn't really feel like there was a lot of info out there for people to go get a financial education. And I now feel like there's a few places that people can go and learn what they should. And I don't feel like there's a comprehensive source, but if I was going to start someplace, I would start with the Rich Dad podcast from Robert Kiyosaki. And him and his team, his CPA, they understand the real game, the game of taxation, the game of loopholes. And I won't even call them loopholes. His CPA actually breaks it down beautifully. And he says, look, the tax code is 95% written by people in Congress to elicit specific behavior. So they're not loopholes, they're requested activities for which if you do, you get deductions and don't pay more taxes. And business owners do these things and pay less in taxes. And those who go to college and just get a job and have a 401k pay a lot in taxes. And they're also going to get screwed at the end of this thing. And that's a little bit what I want to talk about today on the way out the door of 2020. Obviously, there's quite a few things in the news and a lot of things to discuss. But as far as this podcast goes, I'm going to go back to some of the roots. When I think there's educational opportunities, I certainly will discuss them. Today, I was just going to do a whole podcast on unemployment, but instead I'm going to go through that very quickly. And at the end of the day, next year, I'm going to change the format up a little bit. So one of the things, and I'm going to talk about that today, and we're going to do some different things next year with different people that I think will bring a better light onto personal finance and make it more accessible for people. So without further ado, let's just get into some of the news today and some of the things that concern me, and I'll try and loop it all together. So today I was really going to do a full podcast on unemployment. So I have a whole slide presentation. This is left over from October. I was going to do this in November, and showing that, the unemployment rate of what they show us, they're telling us that in October, the fact that the unemployment rate 6.9% is what they're going to tell us. But the reality is that's not true. And how we measure things and the amount of information we can trust from our government is just not really accessible anymore. It's so hard to trust what they tell us, and I'm going to show you why. And it's the same with everything, right? It's the same with the COVID data, right? They're going to tell us how many people are dying versus how many are infected, but meanwhile they know they can't measure the number of infected because so many people just walk through this thing and have zero symptoms. So if 50% of people show no symptoms, they're not getting tested unless somebody they know has COVID. So the data they're giving us is terrible. And it's the same thing with the unemployment data. So they're going to tell us that the unemployment rate's down to 6.9%, but that's not going to tell you the story. Okay? The story is in the data. So if you want to get information on unemployment, the Federal Reserve of St. Louis puts it all together. And this is claims data back before 1970. Okay, so this is as far back as they show it, which is 1967. And what I want to show you is that before 1967, there was no period ever in American history where there was super high number that we see now of unemployment data. of unemployment claims. I mean, this is what happened this year. 7 million people filed a claim in 1 week. This is weekly data. So that's the frequency up here, weekly. So it's obviously smashed together. But those numbers are staggering. But that makes sense in a pandemic. Okay, 7 million people get laid off. What doesn't make sense is the rest of the year. So now I've shortened this graph to just 2020. And what you will see is the prior data is running really low. And again, there'd never been more than 1 million claims. In fact, I think the highest number ever was somewhere around 650,000. And that was the worst week ever in the Great Recession. Okay, well, every single week since March has been higher than that for claims. And that could be multiple people. It's initial claims, so it's that someone could have filed for unemployment here and then filed again here and even filed again here. We don't know. But what we do know is these numbers are staggering. Okay? So the initial claims, and this was, I think, mid-November, up to 778,000 per week. That number in any other year would have been an all-time high. Instead, it's just an average week in 2020. Right? Meanwhile, they're telling us that despite almost 1 million people a week claiming unemployment, that the unemployment rate, it keeps dropping. So this is November. Unemployment claims rise to 778,000, right? Down sharply from the peak of nearly 7 million. Well, why would they even tell you that, right? Because they're trying to context it and almost make you seem like, oh, it's not as bad as it really is, right? But the prior record was 695,000. So in November, set a record. Last week in December, it set another record. That for any other week would have been a record, except for, yes, we had a 7 million peak in late March. But that doesn't mean these things are good data. It just means, oh, it's not 7 million. Well, we can't have 7 million people file for unemployment every week. There's only 180 million people working. So if that goes on for a few weeks, everybody's filed for unemployment. So we have the official rate, which is called the U3, and that is those officially looking for work. So it does not include marginally attached, discouraged workers. It counts part-time workers who would prefer a full-time job as having a job, and they don't take into effect the labor participation rate. But this is where it gets really important. So just like their official inflation rate, the official unemployment rate ends in a lower number, so politicians can talk it up as though they've done something important, which they haven't. So you ask the question, okay, well, they say it doesn't include marginally attached. Well, what does that mean? It means people not looking for work right now because they don't believe they can get a job. Well, how many people is that? And how many people are getting extra unemployment benefits and therefore they're not looking for a job for real anyway? Because maybe they can get a job, but they don't want to take a job because the job they could get will probably pay them less than the unemployment benefits they're getting that the government's going to continue to extend, as they just did in the latest bill. So that's what they're going to do. It also kicks out anyone who's had a hard time finding a job and therefore they're not looking anymore, which kind of makes sense, but kind of doesn't. Because if we want to talk about the number of unemployed people in America, what we should be talking about is the number of people who are able to work and the number of people who are working. And that would be a realistic number. So currently, this number also includes anyone not looking for work because of COVID, such as mothers and fathers staying home to teach kids, those with elderly parents who don't want to risk their the health of the people who live with them. So they're not taking jobs because they're at risk. So if we're going to look at this in a holistic perspective, then we start with population. Okay, so in America, the population was 120 million in 1930. Now we're at 330 million-ish. We'll see what the latest Census Bureau, plus all of the illegal immigrants or people living in America illegally who they're also going to add on to this. But they won't be part of the official count because this is based on census data. So then we go to the U.S. labor force. So just like the population, you would expect it to increase, right? And it has been, except for now it's starting to decline because the baby boomers are retiring. 10,000 baby boomers a day. Sorry, not a week. 10,000 baby boomers per day turn 65, and they're retiring. And that means fewer and fewer people are working. So the labor force is, according to the Federal Reserve, 160 million people. Okay? And that's important number to kind of keep in your head right now. 160 million people are of working age. They're not retired, they're not children, they're not in school. And then we have the labor force participation rate. So as you can see, prior to 1950, it was below 60%, right? And even through the 50s. And if you look at this period, you go, oh, okay, this is before women were working as much as men in the workforce. And then all of a sudden, women's rights movements start to happen more and more. Women get into the workplace, and all of a sudden, we get this huge, huge increase in the labor force participation rate, i.e. people working, people in America making things. But as you see, starting in 2000, which you could say dot-com crisis, and these marks in here are recessions. Okay, so you see recession here, labor force participation drops off of its peak. People stop working. People who are of able-bodied age to work stop working. Drops all the way through the 2000s, comes back a little bit at the end of them, and then the 2008 crisis just plummets it down, right? And since then, we've had this big decline. And look at this drop. So when I'm talking about the labor force participation rate falling off a cliff, this is what I'm saying, is 63% of able-bodied people were working at the beginning of the year, and now it's 60, roughly, and it's coming back to 61. But you could also say, this is 63.5. So we've lost 3 percentage points. 3 percentage points times 160 million is 5 million people no longer considered in the workforce because this is the labor force participation rate. They're not participating, right? So that's a whole lot less people working, which means the real unemployment rate is massively higher than what they're telling us. And all of this just comes down to one very simple point, that And here it is in detail. I blew it up for you. We're almost at 63.5, right? Now we've bounced back to 61.5. 2 percentage points is still 3 million people that aren't even included in the statistics. So if they tell you 10 million people are unemployed, we'll add on another 3 million that have dropped out of participating in the labor force. And your statistics are skewed. But they don't want to tell you that. So here's all of the things you can ask about the labor participation rate. Why are so fewer people participating in October versus January, right? There's a myriad of reasons, but the real unemployment rate is typically about double, i.e. the number of people of age that could work versus the number of people working is typically about half. It seems crazy that we can't agree on what these real statistics should be because they develop these U3s and U1s and U5s to tell us about, what it is. So maybe the problem is employment's difficult to find right now. Maybe people don't want to work. But this means we're producing a lower amount of goods and services in America. This is not good for America. This is not good for everyone's standard of living. When we don't make more stuff, we're buying it from somebody else, i.e. China. And we'll talk about China here in a minute because they're not somebody that we necessarily want to do more and more business with. Now, next year, unless the federal government bails out the state and local governments, there will be a lot of government layoffs coming because state and local governments, unlike the federal government, have to balance their budgets. And many of them are collecting a lot less revenue because sales tax is down in most places, and hotel occupancy taxes are down, and real estate tax is going to be down, especially on commercial buildings where people aren't going to work anymore. There's going to be a big chunk of tax revenue that's not collected, and the governments are going to have to adapt. Recovery is a long way off. If employment is an indicator of how our economy is doing, then we should use a real number. We should use the number that's relevant to all the citizens, not the made-up number the government likes to talk about. We need to include where are these people that should be in the labor force that aren't. Why is the participation rate, when it should be close to 70%, why is it at 61%? And when you look at that and you're like, wait, it could be 5 to 10% of the labor force, 5 to 10% of 160 million people. So 8 to 16 million people that could be working that aren't counted on the unemployment. That's a huge number of people. So, COVID has definitely made stuff worse, especially when it comes to hospitality and restaurants and hotels and airlines and people moving around. But the economy's big problem is still debts, government debts, corporate debt, personal debts. And guess what all of those are at? All-time highs. So the lesson here on government data is just like the inflation data that we went over before. The reported data we get is not the real story. The data is adjusted to make it seem like things are better than reality for the citizens of the U.S. It's just the case of government. You got to understand the data you're receiving and how they come to these numbers, how they, I'm going to say, make them up, how they divide the way to do it. So if the labor force participation rate stays low, we don't have a real economic recovery. The stock market being up is not an economic recovery. That is financial engineering that we should not be doing, that the financial community is doing, that should not be allowed. And again, as I said, if we don't make stuff, then we don't have stuff to buy. So when we look at the historical labor participation rate, current participation rate, plus unemployment, we understand where we really are. And we are, therefore, in a depression and complicated by debt. And what one of the podcasts that I mentioned earlier was Grant Williams. And Grant Williams has this great podcast that he's doing with Bill Fleckenstein called The End Game. And they're talking to all of these luminaries, some of the smartest people in the world when it comes to finance and money and the way things work, about how does this end with all of this debt. And one of the people they interviewed was Dr. Lacey Hunt. And one of the things that he talked about was the law of diminishing returns. And it works out about like this. Whether it's a household, whether it's a business, or whether it's a government, there is a certain amount of debt that you can take on that helps you. So if you're a company, let's say, you take out a certain amount of debt to buy equipment, to buy a building, to pay to set up a production line, or you pay to do R&D to create a product, and then you pay to make. You need money to buy all the materials to make the product. And then when you sell it, people don't pay you immediately. There's usually terms, so you need some money for carrying financing. So a certain amount of debt that you hold as a business is a good thing. But that debt has a cost to it. And after you get to a certain threshold, and according to Dr. Lacey Hunt, that threshold is about 60% of GDP for a government, then you end up in what is known as the law of diminishing returns. And so prior to that, as government is spending money, in the 80s, Reagan said, well, we'll spend some money and that will help. Let's say if we build roads and bridges, then that will help the economy grow faster. The economy will grow faster, create more revenue, and the government will collect this revenue and get its money back. And what Dr. Lacey Hunt's work shows is that up to a certain point, this is true. You spend money into creating infrastructure, into creating, again, buildings and products and all of the things that you need to either make a company and or have a country. And up to that point, those investments give you a real return of more money than you spent. But after 60%, instead of you put $1 in, you get $1.10 out. After 60% of debt, you put $1 in, you get 90 cents out. Now you get to 80% of debt, you put $1 in, you get 50 cents out. At 100% of debt to GDP, you put $1 in, you probably get 40 cents out, and so on and so forth. And then if interest rates actually rise, the cost of that debt becomes overwhelming. And this is when companies go bankrupt. This is when people go bankrupt. And this is when countries go bankrupt. And I mention that because it's the transition into the next thing that I really want to talk about, which is a book. And let me see if I can get this to go away and show the other thing, which is a book called The Fourth Turning. And if you have not read this book, I highly recommend it. And The Fourth Turning is about different cycles of history and different cycles of generations and how those cycles come to an end and how a new cycle begins. And where I find this is, it's certainly relevant, and we're certainly on the road to the fourth turning right now. And where that road ends and the reconciliation that has to happen is between all of this debt. And I've talked about debt on this podcast many times. And debt is definitely not a bad thing, because when we talk about leverage, then using debt actually helps you make more money, and it's a good thing, up until it's not, up until the cost is too high. And what we've done is we've made taking out debt very cheap right now. And that has created mass distortions in the market. But the other thing that we've done is we've made a lot of promises over the last 40, 50 years. Actually, since 1930, since the last major turning, the last fourth turning, where Roosevelt came in and offered us the New Deal. And part of the New Deal was Social Security and Medicare, which was basically supposed to be a safety net for elderly people who hadn't saved enough but were no longer able to work because of their age. And you have to understand that when they created Social Security, the average life expectancy was less than the age at which you were going to get Social Security. So this was not something that everyone was supposed to get. This was supposed to be the safety net for the small percentage of people that were still going to be alive. Now, as advances in medical technology and as our food supply becomes more constant and as we become this great first world nation that America has become, people live longer. But we haven't adjusted the promises based on the length and duration of life. And therefore, the amount of money we have to pay out for the retirees has continued to grow and grow and grow, such that it's unsustainable at this point. And I could do presentation after presentation on all of the debt that's out there and all of the unfunded pensions, right? But here's just a couple of things so that you realize this isn't America. This is from the BBC, okay? So spending review, millions face cut in the value of their workplace pensions. This is literally about British pensions and just how they're going to rise based off of different rates. So just like I was talking about unemployment rate, well, guess what? We have different rates for inflation, right? We have different rates for all sorts of things that the government lies to us about. And what they're basically saying is the government's changing the rate in 2030, and therefore your rate of inflation on your pension is going to be a lot less than the real rate of inflation. That's what they're saying here, okay? So this is just one aspect of their saying, hey, look, here's what's going to happen. Most likely people are going to get lower increases in their pensions than they had planned. And that's just what's going to happen. But what they're not talking about here is how that's going to happen to everybody across the first world, because all of these promises are unfunded. So the Wall Street Journal's got a great article right here about how the pension plans aren't making as much as they need to make, and therefore the amount they have to get funded by the state governments needs to be more. Well, guess what? The state governments are broke too, so they don't have the money to put in. And state pensions are not funded the way that they should be, just like Social Security isn't funded at all. Social Security is paid by current workers. So when we have a lower workforce participation rate, i.e. lower number of people paying into Social Security, there's not enough money to pay for all the 10,000 people a day turning 65. And this is actually kind of the head that the fourth turning gets at, is that this is going to be the real reconciliation of debt. So we look at the 25 trillion the government has right now of current debt that's held in actual treasuries that the government's issued. Okay, so that's a chunk of it, right? Corporate debt is at an all-time high. Individual debt is at an all-time high. All of these debts end up with long-term consequences. So the fourth turning is going to talk about and lead us down the path of this is coming to a head. The promises to the baby boomers that have to be paid by the millennials, and my generation, the Gen X, is stuck in the middle because there's not enough of us to pay for all the pensioners, and there's not enough money coming from the current workers to pay the retired workers, and the government's in tons of debt anyway. And if interest rates rose, so if we look at $25 trillion of debt and we go, okay, right now the government's paying on average about 2% interest rate. Okay? And they've already said they want inflation to go up. Right? And of course they want inflation to go up because then it's cheaper for them to pay off their debts. Right? But if inflation goes up, then the interest rate the government has to pay goes up. So if the government's paying, let's just say 2% interest right now for easy math on $25 trillion of debt, right? Then that's going to be $500 billion a year they pay, which is about 1/8 of the current federal budget. So 1 out of every $8 in taxes the government collects, it pays in interest right now with 2% interest rates. What if interest rates go back to 7%? Which the government might be forced back to that by the free markets, where all of a sudden people just say, well, if inflation's going at 5%, which is what the Federal Reserve wants it to be, then why would I loan you my money at 2% so that when I get my money back, it's worth less? And let me put this into an easier context for you. Let's say a brand new 4Runner costs $50,000. So today I could take my $50,000, buy a brand new 4Runner, park it in the garage. Next year, it's still worth $50,000. The year after that, it's worth $50,000 if I never drive it. All right. Or I could buy gold with that money, and that gold, I would buy enough gold. I would take the $50,000, buy gold with it. Well, if inflation happens, then the price of gold should go up such that that same amount of gold will buy me a Land Cruiser in any year going forward. That's the idea behind precious metals, is they just hold the value, right? So as they print more dollars, it holds value. Well, if inflation's going up at a higher rate than the interest rate, then I'm not getting back the same amount of money. So I give the government $50,000, inflation happens, they give me back $52,000, but meanwhile a new 4Runner costs $55,000. Well, I'm $3,000 out now because I should have just bought the 4Runner and parked it in the garage. Why would I give the government my money at such a low interest rate when they're trying to create inflation? And the answer is that people won't. Right? And if you want an easy example of that, imagine that someone in your family comes and asks you to borrow money for their business. Well, you're not just going to do that same thing. You're not going to give it to them at no interest. You're going to want the interest that to at least cover, hey, I want the same amount of buying power back. I was going to use that money to buy a 4Runner. So if you're going to give me that money back in 5 years, you have to give me back enough to buy the new 4Runner. I want the same amount of money, whatever it costs. If it goes up, great. If it goes down, that could happen too. Deflation's a real possibility and often happens when the governments overspend like this. And that's the worst thing for them because then it's even harder for them to pay down these debts. So the point is that if the government has to pay a real interest rate, and let's say that is 7% on now 25 trillion. Now all of a sudden, instead of paying 500 billion a year in interest, 1/8 of the government's budget, all right, now it's going to pay 3 to 4 times that. So now you're looking at $1.5 to $2 billion, half of the government's budget would just go to interest expense. So where's the money to pay for all the Social Security and Medicare? Where's the money to pay for the government right now? It's not there. And this is the problem. This is the conundrum that they're stuck in. The promises that have been made, there's no money to pay. If you want to look at it at state level, look at Illinois is a great example. I think their pension is 30% funded. So of the money expected to go out over the next, let's call it 30 years, they only have 30% of it. So guess what they're going to have to do? They're going to have to cut the amount of benefits received. It's the inevitable. And this is what's going to create the next huge clash. Now, part of that clash is also going to happen within markets because everything is also way overvalued right now. And this is part of the turning that's coming. And I mention this just because it's something that I want everyone to be aware of when it comes to your money, is that there is a huge change coming. The question is when. How long can this Ponzi scheme of promises of great pensions go on before the people, there's literally no money to pay it, and the government can't print anymore at cheap rates? And I don't know what the answer to that is. I think this may go on 5 to 10 years even before the reconciliation finally happens, before the company that goes bankrupt, the government has to kind of do the same thing, and there has to be a whole overhaul. But when that happens, and this is what I'm going to go work on next year, this is how I'm starting to bring some of these things full circle. I want everybody to understand where this country started and where we've come to. Because I believe that the founding fathers thought long and hard about all of the pitfalls that a nation could run into. And the power of government, and they tried to limit that power. And over the last 100 years, they've done a miraculous job of increasing the power of government. And this is the increasing the part of the deep state that no one really likes and is not good for all of us. And to the average citizen, it seems like you can't win. And this is actually why I believe the labor force participation rate is dropping. So anecdotally, as I said, I went on some business trips, visiting some customers, visiting some vendors the first week of December. And what we found was surprising given what we know about the unemployment numbers. So one vendor who we buy things from would like to run a second shift, but they can't find people that will show up. They have a problem hiring. Another vendor, same thing. They provide other services to us, and they have a hard time finding people to run a second shift. I myself had a very hard time replacing an employee who was out because of COVID, because his daughter's out of school and he's a single father. So he was at home with his daughter, who's young enough that he couldn't just leave her. And therefore I had to find an employee to replace him. It took me about 4 months to finally find somebody who could join our team and who's adequate to do the job. That's a long time to find somebody when there are millions of people that are so-called unemployed. So my theory on this, and I could be wrong, is that there's more and more people who are dropping out of the labor force because they don't see the reason why. You know, if you want to make it a partisan politics conversation, they'd say, well, it's because they're giving them too much in unemployment benefits. For a time, but most people see the short-sightedness of that. I have friends who worked through the whole time when everyone was getting the extra $600 a week in unemployment benefits. And they would have made more money on unemployment. But they also see the long term. And they go, yeah, that would have been nice. And more so, they say that it would have been nice to just have received a bonus, and they kept working. The frustrating part is, why is somebody who's not working making more than the person who is working? It's not exactly the right incentive situation that we like to create. I mean, the part of the free market, the whole principle, the whole reason for a free market is incentives. If you believe incentives matter, then you're for a free market, because you see what happens with government when incentives play no role. Incentives don't matter, then people don't do. And if you want to see the most egregious cases of this, you can go to the countries that have been around the longest. If you want to see the most corrupt governments and the most corrupt systems in the world, go to Greece and go to Italy. Nothing but layers and layers and layers of corruption, because they've been at government for thousands of years. And so they've allowed it to grow. And the reality in America is our government has grown exponentially at the state level, at the local level, and especially at the federal level. And those are the exact things that the framers of our Constitution, these really smart men who sat around and thought about this a lot, who knew history and understood the pitfalls that a nation like America would potentially be under. And that is something to really consider. So one of the things I'm going to do next year is put together a multi-part series on America financially and how we got here. Because the free market system, this is not, everyone wants to call what we have here capitalism. It's not capitalism. Capitalism doesn't require $2 billion to get elected. Capitalism does not, if you want a perfect example of how this is not capitalism, this is not a free market, and who the deep state is and how it works, let's just look at the FDA. I mean, we can look at multiple things across our government and how it doesn't work. So the government's created a war on drugs, a war against its own citizens, because they're the ones using the drugs. And so what have we done? We've made plants illegal. Cannabis is a plant with a lot of medicinal value. The government used to pay people to grow hemp in the 40s for rope for the war. Then we're going to make plants illegal. Psilocybin, which probably has a ton of positive psychoactive effects. We're going to make it illegal, so we can't even study it. We're going to make all the psychoactives illegal, so we can't study them, despite the fact that they might even help us, might help our soldiers. MDMA is finally getting a chance to show that, it can be abused recreationally, as can anything. It's got serious medicinal value. So why is the government deciding all of these things for us? Why are they our big brother? That's just one. We've also have a war on poverty. And since we've created the war on poverty, we have more poor people than ever. California has the highest tax rate, also the highest homeless population. Go figure. Those two things seem to run in opposite directions, but really run together. And I'm going to go over why. And if you want to look at something right now, you could look at what the FDA did this week. So this week, the FDA decided not to change the recommended daily consumption of sugar and alcohol, despite a scientific advisory panel probably made up of actual people who know science and, saying that we should consume less sugar. And you don't need to be a genius to look around America, especially during the age of COVID and the comorbidity being a problem. We're an unhealthy nation, in large part because of sugar. Sugar is horrible for the human diet. It has not been in the diet for very long, and it does all sorts of bad things. Causes a lot of inflammation and makes people obese. Let's just be honest about it. So it's not really a stretch to just say, hey, maybe we should recommend less sugar. If it was up to me, I would recommend no sugar. So what we end up with is the deep state is the sugar companies, and not just the companies that make sugar, but the companies that distribute sugar, i.e. Coca-Cola and Pepsi-Cola being the two largest sugar distributors. But now they put sugar in all sorts of foods. Meanwhile, they've told us that fat is bad, that fat causes heart disease. But it's actually the fat mixed with sugar that causes small particle LDL cholesterol, as I learned from Dr. Rhonda Patrick, who, another podcast I'd recommend if you're really concerned about your health. She's a good one to follow. She's the one who's out there saying, take vitamin D, take zinc. She's looking at the studies that show how to extend your life expectancy. Things that are useful and helpful. Now, she often talks at a level that's understandable mostly by doctors because she gets down into details that make my head spin. But it's great information, good stuff. And if you just pick up a couple little pieces along the way, you'll be healthier and happier. Right? So we've got a government that the FDA won't take the recommendations of scientists because Pepsi and Coke have more influence in the government than scientists. It's just one more example of how our government is completely broken. And why do these people have so much influence? The FDA, since they created dietary guidelines, has overseen a massive increase in obesity, taking zero responsibility for that. Zero. But if they said, so here's the thing, if the guideline became, we recommend no sugar in the American diet, then guess what they have to do at every single school? They have to pull out all the vending machines selling soda. They have to remove sugar from all the school meals. That would be a wonderful, powerful thing to do in America. Not going to happen anytime soon. So there are a lot of problems that have been created because we didn't listen to the founding fathers and the way that they set it up. Benjamin Franklin was not being facetious when he said, here's a republic if you can keep it. He was very, very serious about that because he studied history. He knew the problem is people. And when this fourth turning comes to a head, and it will, it's inevitable. As I've said, I just look at it from a debt cycle perspective, and we're there. And it's not just America. Europe's just as bad. China's just as bad. Everybody's broke and overspent and overpromised. That's just the reality of what's happened. And everybody's in a pseudo race to now play with their currencies and do all sorts of other tomfoolery that makes no sense. Why we have these fake currencies that mean nothing because they can just print dollars. And the government's about to do that. I actually think that's part of the process here is the government can come in and they're going to try out this modern monetary theory. I mean, they just did it again. They're going to issue checks to everyone in America who individually made less than $75,000 or as a couple made less than $150,000. Everyone's getting a check. But wait a minute. We, the people, are the ones who pay taxes and send a check to the government. And now the government's sending us checks because they've got all sorts of extra money. Now, I'm not opposed to the people who really need a check getting a check. I'm not opposed to helping people who lost their jobs and are about to lose their apartment or who are going hungry from feeding and clothing and housing American citizens. But that does not mean everyone gets a check. If you still have a job, I don't need a check. Now, I make more than their threshold, so I'm not getting a check anyway. But let's just say I made $74,000 last year and the year before that. Now, and let's say my wife makes the exact same. So we're just under the threshold. Now, let's say neither one of us lost our jobs. Why is the government sending us checks? Why aren't those checks just going to the people who actually need them? And now they want to send out a $2,000 check. Great. Another $600 billion goes out. And they think it's going to create spending, but it's not. What it's doing is creating more and more and more speculation. In fact, there was an article last week in the Wall Street Journal that said margin debt, which is the gambling amount that people are borrowing to bet on stocks, all-time high. Stock market's not frothy at all. No. Everyone's just gambling. And that's what it's viewed as. And the government's giving you more money to gamble. What do you think they're going to do with it? At the same time, you tell all these people that you don't have to make a student loan payment, you don't have to make a house payment, you don't have to make a car payment, you can't get evicted. So they're going to take all that money and do the same thing. Let's go gamble with it. Why not? So this MMT of we're going to give everybody free money regardless of whether they need it or not, everybody should get a check. No, everybody does not need a check. I don't need a check. Don't send me a check. What I need is if MMT works so well, which just says we can just print money and there's no problems. If it works so great, then here's the kicker. Why am I paying taxes at all? And this is actually something that I'm going to get into and talk a lot about in the series I'm going to do next year, is the taxation system in America. And the founding fathers specifically, if you read the Constitution, they did not give the federal government the ability to tax citizens. They specifically prohibited that. And the reason I know they specifically prohibited it is because they have a lot of things on taxation in the Constitution. And it's specifically left out. And they said that taxes should only be proportioned to the states equally, meaning South Dakota pays the same amount of taxes to the federal government as California, as Texas, as New York. So that's going to be a pretty low number. And that was the whole idea, to keep government small. And you give government the ability to tax, and what happens? Its power grows. And now all of a sudden the job that basically used to be one of let's do the right thing for the American people and it's a job of service becomes a job of power. And the exact wrong people that you want in charge of your government are now in government. People who crave power. And those are not the people we want leading us. And they have led us down this path. And we are going to get, the reason that I bring up the fourth turning is this is going to bring all of this to a head. And we are going to have to fundamentally reset and ask the question, what is the role of government? What do we want our government to do? And more specifically, what is it not going to do? And for those of us who believe that incentives matter, this will be an opportunity to limit the overreach of government. The same government, by the way, that is currently collecting all of our data, all of our phone records, texts, emails, everything that goes across the internet, they're collecting all of that illegally. That's what Edward Snowden showed, is the government was illegally collecting data on all of its citizens. And if they allow the digital dollar to go through and they allow the Federal Reserve to set up Fed accounts for every citizen, where now all of a sudden all of our financial transactions are now also tracked by the government, you're going to end up with a totalitarian state. No different than China. And if you want to discuss the things that are going on in China right now, they don't sound like a free country. So if you're not of the right religion and not of the right party, then you can be sent to camps to make you understand what the right party and the right religion are. And then after you get out of those camps, they'll put you to work in factories. And if you think I'm making this up, just go Google it and research it. Now, China's already out with, we'll call it China coin. And their reserve bank is basically running digital currency transactions. Now, they're not doing it because things need to be digital. In fact, most payments in China are made digital already. What they're doing is trying to get around the US Euro SWIFT payment system, where transactions are conducted in dollars and euros. And they want people to conduct with the Chinese government directly. So this is a government that, like I said, will straight up imprison its citizens. They don't even abide by their own agreements. They agreed with Great Britain that Hong Kong would be treated as a separate democratic state for, I think, 40 or 50 years. They've already gone back on that. The people who led protests in Hong Kong tried to flee to Taiwan. They've been arrested and they've been taken to mainland China and they're now been sentenced. And they're all going to jail. And amazingly, they all confess to their crimes. Because in China, when you go to court, you confess to your crimes. Or you go back to jail and get beaten until you're ready to go to court and confess to your crimes. That's the way the system works. And we think that can't happen here, but I believe it can. And to bring this full circle, we're going to have this fourth turning moment where we're going to have the opportunity to either decide we want to shrink our government, control the size of it, and we are going to specifically list out the duties and the job of government. What is the role of it? And we're going to limit that and have a free economy. And we certainly need to limit the corporate influence and what big companies, and we could just limit the size of companies. That's the easiest way to do it. Too big to fail is simply just too big. We used to have thousands and thousands of small banks, and some of them would fail because they made bad decisions. Instead now, we have a few big ones, and they're all too big to fail, even though they're all leveraged up, and they're all gonna fail. Which is then it collapses the entire system, which is a horrible, horrible thing to be in too. So we're going to get to this point where we're going to make this decision. And my concern is that instead of going the free market route, the market that's led to all the prosperity in America, we're going to decide that the role of government is to do everything. This would be the socialist versus free market discussion. And they want to say what's going on now is capitalism and free markets, but as I said, it is not. And we will go into that. And capital markets should not be the gambling hall that they all are now. We don't need financial engineering. It's unnecessary. And it's disappointing because you have a lot of really, really smart people doing nothing but worrying about chasing currency around and realize that currency is a construct made up of man. Now, you can go back to my early podcast on currency, and I'm going to tell you it's necessary for transacting in goods, but this is why gold and silver worked so well. Everyone knew there was a limited amount of it, and everyone knew what its value was. When you run dollars off a printing press or just create them digitally, how many are them, what's worth what, it's hard to comprehend. And the reason finance is so complicated is because the whole thing's abstract. If we were all great human beings, we wouldn't need money. I'm telling you, and I believe this wholeheartedly, the pyramids were not built with money. Machu Picchu was not built with money. Angkor Wat was not built with money. You didn't have slaves build something so precision and perfect as the pyramids, perfectly aligning astrologically, perfectly built, able to withstand thousands of years. That was not built by slaves being fed beer. Come on. That was obviously a technology that we've lost and we don't have today. But it was not based off of paying people wages to do something. Otherwise, we'd probably do one right now. Bezos is rich enough to build himself some pyramids, I think. But I don't think anyone could do it. Much less slaves. So I'm going to go into the history of the U.S. in some detail, where you're going to get a history lesson, but also a finance lesson. That's going to take some time to prepare. So I will still throw out some podcasts from time to time, the stuff that becomes relevant. Since the election, I've kind of been just trying to sit back and not engage very much in the political world and see what they're doing. Instead, I'm preparing for the future now. I know it's coming. The only question is when. The fourth turning is on its way. MMT, I believe, is here to shell out more money and force us into that situation even sooner, because the idea that the government's going to collect more money is crazy because it's never happened. And there's a very simple thing that says bad money will chase out good money. And that means that the really wealthy people have other places they can go and other places they can park their money. So you can't just tax the rich your way out of it. There's not enough money there. The debts are way, 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 way too big. So that's going to be one series that I'm going to do next year. I got another one that hopefully I'm doing with my friend Don, where we're going to do what we're calling dollar dilemmas and help people in bad financial situations figure out what's the best thing they can do based on their situation and try and help people out. And I'm going to start by trying to help him, and then hopefully we'll repeat that with other people. And I think that'll be a very valuable lesson on lessons in finance in the real world. And those are going to be the main things for next year. And I'm considering doing a university type course in all of money, and putting that down so that that's there on the record for people to go and reference whenever they really want an education. It's embarrassing to me that you can get a degree from a university and not know anything about money when it's one of those things we're going to deal with our entire lives. So that's what next year looks like for Keep Yours. Thanks for listening. Appreciate all the feedback and all of the support. And if you have any topics that you'd like us to specifically discuss, please let me know. And don't feel free to reach out to us. And have a happy new year. And hope everyone's safe and thriving in 2021. And know that some difficult times are ahead. But this is the course of human history. And we all get to live through it. And if you're looking for other places to go for financial information, specifically, I said the Rich Dad Poor Dad podcast from Robert Kiyosaki is a great one. What I would not recommend, because it's going to make no sense in the world we have going forward. We're currently, an easy example is I just refinanced our house again for the second time this year and took money out and turned a 15-year mortgage into a 30-year mortgage because right now the rates are so low that what I believe will be real inflation from this MMT money printing, inflation will be higher than the interest rates. So in the same way that I just talked about earlier, that you would not loan somebody money to give you back less in buying power, that's what they're offering right now. A long-term loan where they're going to give it to you. So that loan is an asset. Hard thing to wrap your head around. But if you go listen to, what is that guy's name? That Dave Ramsey. He'll tell you debt's horrible. And he'll also tell you that the people who fought having to pay tax to the federal government are Looney Tunes. But he's not one that I would recommend at all. If you want information on what's going on in the financial world and economics, Grant Williams' podcast is absolutely amazing. And George Gammon has a great podcast as well. And I feel like there's enough educational information on the markets and what's going on at that level that I'm going to leave that alone. And long-term, my transition will be more to small business and help with small business setups and operations, because that's actually really my expertise. So again, thanks for listening. Wish you a happy new year, and I will catch up with you next time. Cheers.